The angel of silence is passing over us.
Good afternoon. I'm Dana Gioia, the director of the Harman Eisner Program in the Arts at the Aspen Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation about the future of live theater. We have three diversely and abundantly distinguished guests, starting nearest to me, the playwright David Ives, Aspen's own Anna Deavere Smith, author, actor, and Michael Eisner, whose career I will describe to you in some detail. I want to spend a little bit of time with Michael Eisner because I think it's a very interesting story which leads into this, and a little less on David and Anna, whom I've actually introduced to this audience several times already this week. Michael Eisner started college as a pre-med, but was led astray by English literature and theater. He worked at NBC, CBS, and ABC, I think all in a matter of about 7 months, before he figured he better stick with someplace, and eventually became vice president of program planning at ABC. He then, in 1974, became the president and COO of Paramount during really one of the great eras of that studio, and then 10 years later became chairman and CEO of Disney, where he transformed this traditionally profitable and distinguished small studio into a global entertainment powerhouse. And most specifically for today's discussion, created a new division for the company, Walt Disney Theatricals, which brought out productions like Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, and High School Musical, which not only had a presence on Broadway and huge touring companies, but also in terms of licensing theatrical properties. I know many of you were in our conversation with David Ives last night at Belly Up, where we did a production of David Ives' marvelous one-act play, Sure Thing. Our leading lady last night, Paige Price, told me this morning that she got her Broadway start from Michael Eisner in Beauty and the Beast. And I think that one of the interesting things about Walt Disney Theatrical is that it has refreshed theater in the sense of both being, for many people, the first entry point, the first time a child or an adolescent sees a live theatrical presentation, but also has helped train a whole generation of professional actors and given them paying work, which is what every artist needs. In 2004, Mr. Eisner left Disney to create Tornante Company. Tornante is Italian for a hairpin curve on a road, which is an entertainment development and investment company. He's also hosted his own business and entertainment interview show, Conversations with Michael Eisner, and has even filled in for Charlie Rose on the Charlie Rose Show as the host. He also, for the Aspen Institute, has been the co-endower of the arts program here with Sid Harman and Michael Eisner, which is the Harman Eisner Program in the Arts. Our first distinguished visiting Harman Eisner artist was Anna Deavere Smith, who has not only came as our visiting artist, but has essentially become part of Aspen. It's hard to imagine Aspen Institute without Anna these days, who's now even joined the board and has been a continual presence both in Colorado and elsewhere with the Institute. Finally, David Ives, who I think most of you saw last night, is a magnificent comic playwright. To correct my misstatement last night, his collection of short plays, All in the Timing, has frequently been the most widely produced play in the United States not written by Shakespeare. Thank you, each of you, for coming here. And David, since you're nearest for me to get you in my clutches, could I ask you just to start the conversation by saying something about your own sense of where live theater is in the United States today?
I think that I was actually surprised by the topic that we had, because I think that, of course, it's the age-old question of the future of theater. I'm sure that Sophocles, was talking about it in front of a group very like this in togas, 2,500 years ago, when they were worried that there weren't any, chorines to take part in his plays. I think that for those of you who weren't at the presentation last night, I'll just repeat something that I said back then, which is that I actually think that we are living in one of the great golden ages of the theater. and that if you just look at the number of playwrights that we have or have recently had writing in English alone, it is extraordinary, and we have outdone the Elizabethans, and I'll just do a quick count. Edward Albee is still alive, and as I said last night, it is like having Aeschylus with us. You know, we have David Mamet, we have Sam Shepard, we recently had Harold Pinter and Samuel Beckett, we have August Wilson, and extraordinary playwrights who are not in that uppermost, unreachable pantheon, but who are still writing extraordinary plays. Young playwrights like Lynn Nottage, who just won the Pulitzer Prize for Ruined, if any of you saw that. And so from my perspective, I feel like I am so blessed to be writing in this age. And I hate using Broadway as a sort of measuring stick for what the theater is doing. But if you look at this past year, when the world recession seemed to hit everything except Broadway in New York, we had an extraordinary Broadway season, although I was supposed to have a play on Broadway which did not make it because of the world recession, and so I have my own feelings about that. But there are certainly causes for worry, I think, about the state of the theater. I can speak about New York best. One of which is the death of off-Broadway, or the moribund state of off-Broadway because of real estate values in New York. But the off-Broadway world of the theater is so alive. There are people still starting storefronts at age 23 to put up plays, and it is. I walk down the street and meet playwrights every day, young playwrights, and so I think that theater is going to go on as long as there's a 16-year-old who gets bitten and who has the passion to put those passions on stage live rather than on film or on anything else. And just as a last point, ironically, I think that there are other media that are seeing the curtain going down on them before theater. For example, movies as we know them are certainly not going to be the same in the next 20 or 25 years. There will come a point when we will be in front of holograms, and the movies that we see now that look so real to us will be antiques the way that black and white movies are antiques to, for example, my nieces, who will not look at a movie that doesn't have sound or is in black and white. And so I feel as if theater is going to survive simply because it is a local art. It is a live art. Nothing can replace the presence of the live actor. And beyond that, the numinous presence of a star. People still continue to want to pay to see stars, and they will pay $125 a pop and take their family to see them, because nothing can replace that electrical charge that comes from seeing people in person. And so from my perspective, I'm very hopeful about the theater right now, and so I'll just leave it at that for where I am.
Michael?
Yeah, I'm a little upset because I was assuming Dave was going to go the other direction, and I was going to violently disagree. So I don't have that opportunity, except to say I don't agree about the movies. But that's another symposium. I think the movies are in excellent shape. It's just how you do it. But that's a different subject. Yes, I agree. The theater is not dead. It's not dying. It's not on life support. It hasn't been hit by a car, anything like that. I think, to add to what was said, I think last year was the biggest number of tickets sold in the history of Broadway, 12 million tickets, more tickets than were sold to all New York sporting events. So the legitimate theater is that legitimate theater in New York is healthy. It's very expensive, which is one of the problems with off-Broadway. The New York Times has an attitude about the theater, the constant moaning about its death, which I think the only thing that my problem with the New York Times and the theater is that when tickets cost $25, a full-page ad in the New York Times costs $25,000. When it costs $50, full-page ad costs $50,000. Now that it costs $120 a ticket, a New York Times ad costs $120,000 for a full-page ad. The most expensive advertising section in the New York Times is arts and leisure. So that issue, the issue of cost, It's not a union issue. It's just the age-old issue of cost versus creative impetus. I think that New York theater is strong. The regional theater is, say, a high school theater, that kind of amateur theater. I don't know about other types of theater done, but I know there's 6,000 Disney plays done a year in the high schools. So it's not Aeschylus being done 6,000 times, but it is creating an environment where young people love to perform in it. I was very reluctant for the Disney company to go into theater. Paramount, we did My One and Only, and the high point of that was Twiggy trying to make Tommy Tune straight. That was the backstage drama. It was as much work to put on My One and Only, and Mike Nichols was involved, and we had great people. And as expensive as to do one movie, and a movie would play in 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 theaters. A Broadway show would play in one theater, so when I went to Disney, I said, no, we're not, that's it. We're going to be a movie company, a television company, and other things. And then we made Beauty and the Beast, and it was great to see Paige here. And the New York Times reviewed, Frank Rich said, this is the best musical on Broadway, but it wasn't a musical on Broadway, it was an animated film. So we sat around and said, having seen Cameron McIntosh and Andrew Lloyd Webber take over the world with legitimate theater, we said, let's give it a try. And here in Aspen, we used all Disney people because Walt Disney World does more legitimate theater than all the rest of the country combined, including Broadway. So we had a lot of talent there. They came here and they showed us how they were going to turn it into a musical. And that was that. So we learned that we could be incredibly financially well off in the theater, which seemed to, in the past, yes, you knew that specific actors or actresses, or you knew that playwrights could earn a living, but you never knew that it could be the kind of business that a Disney could really prosper through. So I'm a big believer in story. I'm a big believer in a beginning, middle, and end. I'm a big believer that all of these mediums do not go, none of them ever go away. The theater will never go away. I don't think radio goes away. I don't think movies go away. They change, they adapt, they overlap. 1 and 1 tends to add to 3. This whole digital world is only going to help theater as well. So I'm extremely excited that theater has become, on the high end, a successful business, and on the entry level, the young playwrights, there are just an enormous number of places that they can be seen.
Yep.
Well, I'm concerned about your report, your NEA report, that whereas musicals have increased in terms of the desire that audiences have to see them, and the so-called straight plays have decreased considerably since the 90s, and I don't really know what that means. I imagine there could be lots of different reasons for that. The problem of the straight play on Broadway or in New York, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit. You all will probably know more than me. I suppose what is curious to me about, and I don't think the theater is, the curtain's closing on the theater either. But I'm very interested that we seem to have leftover business from the 70s popping up again now, and I don't know why. As many of you probably know from the New York Times, a young undergraduate at Princeton, an economist, Emily Sands, did a study of women playwrights and determined, and this was all, even though she's on her way to Harvard and just an undergrad at Princeton, very established professors reviewed her study and thought it was legitimate, comes out with the evidence that, in fact, women playwrights are discriminated against, and the culprit actually seemed to be women artistic directors. And as the Times reports this, Patricia Cohn in the Times reports it, when they gave that part of the information about women artistic directors, somebody back deep in the house, yelled out, "Could you say that again?" And apparently the end of the giving of the report was a lot of rousing applause. Interestingly enough, the Times a week later, the same writer, Patricia Cohn, writes an article about the success of some women directors on Broadway, naming 3 of them, I think. And so I don't know if other people who in the 70s, and when I arrived in New York in the 70s, there were a variety of theaters that were dedicated to the work of women, not as many now. I wonder if other groups who also in the 70s sort of had a place to go and a platform from which to try to have their cultures or their identities spoken to, theaters of color, which have now, many of them have disappeared, if these groups will also come about again. My disappointment is that, 30-some years later, this is not resolved. And I don't know what that means because, of course, there's a wealth of talent and culture which is not being exploited. So I just put that out there. I don't know what it means. I know at even the level of foundations, there is a concern that there is no diversity in the leadership of theaters, or very little. Don't know what that means. Then on the other hand, I look at, and this interests me as well. It may be related. As a teacher, I'm a professor at NYU. Most of the kids who come to study with me want to do new work, find new methods, new forms. Many of them want to work with a one-person show in a new way. I teach in a department that's mostly for theory, performance studies, but many of them want to work out some of that theory in performance. And then this year, very surprising to me, I had a lot of the kids in my class were graduate students in the School of Education who weren't coming to figure out like how to put arts in the schools, which is part of it, but how to use performance as a way of performing and embodying some of the theories they were learning. And I think that an interesting kinds of theater could come from that. Will it all be good? No. But you never know when a very talented person is going to come through the back door. I mean, you were in medicine and English before you became what you are. I don't know what you started as, and for all I know, you could have been a physicist. Dana, I'm not sure.
You didn't see my grades in math.
But I'm very interested that sort of these students in the arts are not, talented people aren't going just to get into conservatories to go the normal path, but that they want to do new things in a new way.
Well, as Oscar Wilde said, youth is America's oldest tradition. And if you look at the NEA statistics, which look at all arts participation, one of the most interesting things you notice is that most art forms, actually at this point, virtually every art form is decreasing except for musicals, which seem to be not merely now the entry point for live theater, but the entry point for almost all the performing arts, singing, dancing, opera, dance. And live theater is going down. And across all of those theatrical venues, the average age of the audience is increasing. And so, especially for live theater, the audience tends to be older, educated, affluent, and white. Do you have any reflections in terms of, this
I
is
have
simply
a lot. I have a lot. Actually, it's interesting that you...
Let me just finish a sentence. Do you have any reflections on that? And also about what do you think is the best way to bring a new generation of audiences to live theater?
Well, I actually think it's interesting that you break it up into musicals and live theater, whereas actually musicals are live theater. And if I might put in a word of defense for the musical is one of the, along with jazz, the Martini and the Airplane, is one of the few, absolutely Native American institutions. And so just to add to my list of the golden age that we're living in, we have a Shakespeare living among us, and his name is Stephen Sondheim. I mean, this is not appreciated, that we have a creator who for 50 years has documented our social life in the most vibrant way, a true genius of the theater, who has gone from Gypsy to West Side Story to Company to Follies to Sweeney Todd. These are not only documentations of our social history in feeling, in brilliant, eloquent words, but these are, some of them, absolutely perfect works of art. And so, for me, I don't divide up the theater in that way. To me, all theater is theater. And the American musical, when it's good, and if you look at Carousel, heartbreaking. If you look at The King and I, a perfect work of art. If you look at some of the other musicals from the 30s and 40s, you are looking at an art form which is so eloquent and so alive, and which beyond straight plays reflects the Greek idea of theater, which is that theater is not only spoken, theater is sung, theater is in some way going to be unreal, hyper-real, I should say, and it uses music to do that. And I think that the answer to this question of making audiences younger, I think that we're seeing that happen right now. You may have noticed that the Tony Award for Best Music and Lyrics, not to use the Tony as a measure, went to Next to Normal, which was young writers writing about bipolar depression in a musical, and drug addiction, and also the advent of pop music and rock and roll into the musical theater. Nobody's really quite known how to do it because we've been living under the shadow of Stephen Sondheim, who is an inimitable genius. And so for years, we've had musical theater writers trying to be Stephen Sondheim, which they cannot be. And now we see young writers like Tom Kitt, for example, coming up, and you see younger audiences going in to see those things. When I went to see Next to Normal, half of the audience, I would say, was under 50, and they were so moved by this. And the New York Fringe Festival and the New York Musical Theater Festival. Musical theater, I can tell you, can be as eloquent as any play. If you've seen Sweeney Todd or Follies, you know that. Those are the Hamlet and the King Lear of American theater in the last 50 years. And so I would not divide it up that way. And I will just stop at that.
Well, I would just ask you how, I think I agree with everything you've said about musicals. How would you then rephrase the categorization or revise the concern for the so-called straight play? How would you think about it differently?
I think I was very taken by your worry about straight plays, but again, to use Broadway, this was a magnificent year for plays on Broadway. There were more plays new plays than musicals on Broadway this year.
It's not I'm just quoting the NEA report.
But
I was just giving the facts of the NEA.
But I'm saying that the NEA report is actually undone by this year in the theater. And so, but I'll tell you what's a little troubling is...
No, actually the numbers, which will be new numbers, which will be released next week, will show that the spoken theater number has gotten even worse.
Oh,
and I don't know if it's perhaps what we have in New York is for a variety of cultural reasons, economically stronger spoken theater.
I think it may be a false division, and I haven't seen how the statistics were arrived at. But I think the division actually is that there are two theaters. There is Broadway, which is a form of entertainment, of mass entertainment, and I do not look down on Broadway at all. It provides a kind of theater, star-driven theater, usually very expensive theater, not always. Sometimes it brings exciting new sort of alternative work, like Neil LaBute's play this year was as close as that got. But the spoken theater, I'm talking about young playwrights, and this is happening more and more, who act as their own producers now. I know a director who got together with a playwright, and all they do is produce that playwright's work. And they have been wildly acclaimed. It's only spoken plays. And so in that world that used to be called off-Broadway, which is now sort of called fringe theater, there is this continued rapturous feeling about how to make theater, which is rough, raw, cheap, seat of the pants. And so in that theater, I am sure that plays are still as hot as ever. And, just check the listings in the New York Times and you'll find it. You will not find those plays on Broadway because that is not what Broadway is providing. It's a different audience. I'll tell you something that worries me, though, about the women's plays and Broadway is that Lynn Nottage won the Pulitzer Prize for Ruined, and nobody has talked about bringing that to Broadway. And since when do we not bring Pulitzer Prize plays to Broadway? I mean, this is unheard of, and so they've kept it in the basement at Manhattan Theater Club. And so I say that there is a resistance that that is palpable to a work which cannot be categorized as something that they can sell and sell a lot of tickets to. And so I think that, yes, Broadway may not be bringing a lot of new plays, but that's not where new plays came from. They always came from off-Broadway. Now they're coming from off-Broadway, the regionals, other places. So.
Well, I think this argument has gone on for a while. In the Restoration period, everybody criticized the Restoration spectaculars, which were, trapdoors and Baroque sets and flying through the air and off-color stuff. And the criticism at the NEA in 1670, was that the Restoration drama wasn't getting its due amount. And, the fact of the matter is, commercial theater, commercial spectaculars tend to attract, a large, audience. And it's probably easier to fly around and do a trapdoor and wear stupid clothes or great clothes than it is to write a spoken, well-crafted, in the good sense of the word, theater.
That's hard to believe.
It's easier or harder?
It's hard to believe that it's easier to have trapdoors and people flying around than to.
Well, it is. I'm an expert at that. What's hard? What's hard?
It's very discouraging.
It's expensive. I didn't say it wasn't expensive, and that's a whole issue that we probably should get to. But the reason that I think, one of the reasons I think that our Broadway shows are good, and one of the reasons that I think so many musicals fail, is they don't address the story and the emotion and the interpersonal reactions. And I can remember leaving a theater in my 20s, Baker Street, where Clive Barnes said, I left the theater whistling the set. And that always struck me, well, I guess the set should be the last thing we worry about. Let's worry about what is a legitimate show. I think it is fine that there are more spectacles. I think it is fine that kids all over the country are getting addicted to wanting to be, the star of Lion King, or I'm just using the stuff that I'm very familiar with. I think that sets the pace to be educated in the theater. I just came from the Mark Penn lecture on new trends, and he said that last year there was 36,000 orchestra productions, and that the sale of classical music is at an all-time high. And he attributes that to the internet, because people can now separate pieces of some great classical work and just take what they like, and now they're getting more into it. I think we have a lot going on. The problem is, it's not the theater that's in trouble, it's the economy that's in trouble. So, yes, the NEA is, up to $150 million. That's what it was in 1970, so it's not like it's startlingly has grown. I wasn't involved, but the people that I know very well were involved with the Los Angeles Olympic Festival, and then 3 years later, the Los Angeles Festival. And you had, the Times Mirror Company, and you had Arco and Occidental, and all these companies supporting it. The problem is the nonprofit theater, which is supported by corporate gifts and all government and all that sort of stuff, is hurting because of the economy. So a lot of legitimate plays come out of, the Mark Tabor and other places like that. And yes, 60% of their sales are in ticket sales, but the other 40% are in donations, which have dried up. So maybe the panel should have been said, is the economy, in that the economy is in trouble, how has that affected the theater? And I think that's a real issue which will resolve itself.
But I think that depends on what you want out of the theater. I think that, I'm sort of sorry that we're talking about, for the people for playwrights and directors and actors, and I've worked Broadway, off-Broadway musicals, adaptations, I don't know anybody who's in the theater for money. Only, with all due respect, producers are in the theater for money. And so...
Boy, I've dealt with a lot of agents that don't... I wish you were right.
Agents,
I don't think you're right.
But agents are not in the theater. Agents are battened onto the theater.
So they just get that way when they cross the Rockies and get to Hollywood?
No, I think that... But
that high air says, hey, I can have a second house. And they come out to us?
here's an example of that comes off of what you were just saying about nonprofit theaters and people creating theater. Nonprofit theaters right now, there is a move, and I'm sorry to talk business when we should be talking about art, which is actually the most important and interesting thing about the theater. But on the business side of the theater, playwrights are getting crushed little by little by more and more people wanting a piece of the check that used to go straight to the playwright. And nonprofit theaters are now taking subsidiary rights from playwrights, which is a crime. They are supposed to be there for the good of the playwright, and actually they take a piece of your earnings for 10 years. And it can be very high. And so I don't understand how they are getting past the tax man or getting past the government, because they actually don't have the right to take that money. They're supposed to be using what money they make to further the good of the art that they're producing. That's why they're called nonprofit theaters. And so the Dramatist Guild is deeply involved in trying to bring that wave back, because not only are theaters doing that, directors are sometimes now taking a piece of the playwrights' paycheck, so that if playwrights see no reason, even if they're not in it for the money, if there is no money coming back from something that they have legitimately written that's good, then what is the reason for them not to go and work on a television show? And so there is this horrible
Well, there are aesthetic reasons, of course.
There are aesthetic reasons, but people are in the theater because they love it. And I said this last night, the only reason you can go into the theater is because you love it. You can't, if you want to go into the theater for money, you are either a fool or you are writing meretriciously or acting meretriciously, because you have to do this thing because you love it. And that's why the theater is so special, because the theater, to me, and I've said this in print before, I don't believe that it's an accident that the theater and democracy came into the world at the same time, because the theater is the perfect reflection of a democracy at work. It is a group of people getting together, resolving to work in spite of all differences, emotional and otherwise, and agreeing to make something good. And everybody agreeing to play their part in that, no matter what it is, in order to create something that works. And so there is nothing headier than being in a room with people who outside the room do not get along, who say, we are going to make something good. And so that is how theater works. That is not about money. That is about creating something good, about feeling the same thing, thinking about the same thing, and making it right. And, yeah.
I just want to ask something you said and take it back to that NEA report. Dana, help me understand this. It seems as though the report is also suggesting that in the nonprofit theaters outside of New York, I guess, or maybe all around, that there's been a growth of those organizations, and that in terms of management and so forth, they're very healthy and they're run very well.
Yeah,
How did artists get cut out of that? I mean, when I do theater, my show that I'm working on right now, I walk away with $50 more a week than my assistant.
Well, let me just give you a couple of basic facts that in terms of the national trends for theater, we've probably never had so many theatrical institutions. They are putting on more performances than they did 10 years ago. They are relatively well managed in terms of financial measurements, even if they're operating at a slight deficit. The interesting thing is that even though there are more theaters and they're putting on more performances, the absolute audience is going down, which means that the audience per performance is going down even more. And they are, in a sense, they've got a strategy that isn't working. I think that they get a lot of pressure. This is, we haven't studied the internal financials of this, but I've had actually a lot of discussions with boards about this. They're getting a lot of pressure from their boards, which are largely people in the business world, saying, well, if you create a work, as you would in a for-profit world, why don't you get a piece of it? And so this has been, I think this has been something that's really happened over the last 10 years, and it's happened almost nationally.
I think you have to.
And in fact, it's a point of pride with these institutions that they are now operating like the for-profit theater.
Yeah, I just would have to say that on some of what you said, I don't agree. And all people that are producers or wear suits or on boards or in business are not black hats, and all artists are not white hats, and all artists are not black hats. It's just not the way it is. That would be a bad play. In other words, you would say, what a stereotype, change it, or we're not going to produce it. The fact of the matter is, if it was not a business, it would be called show. That's what Woody Allen said in his movie. I love Woody Allen. I take it for a fact. It is a big responsibility for regional theater, for a big company, for a little company, to stay in business. I've learned this the hard way over my whole career. Money tends to oil the process. It just does. And if you have good funding, you can do a lot of different things. When Sidney Harmon stood up at the Aspen Institute board meeting and explained that the Aspen Institute was lacking a major piece, which was the reporting and the conversation and the exaltation of the arts at the Aspen Institute. And he is extremely articulate, as you know. And I go to a lot of meetings where they ask for money. I never stand up, ever, particularly at UJA. Everybody stands up. I don't stand up. I stood up and said, I'm with you, because even the Aspen Institute is amazingly enhanced, and I think you guys are an example of it, by the arts. But the Aspen Institute is also an economic body, and it had to be funded. And I do believe that one of the reasons that attendance may be down in the theater, and remember at one time 87 million people a week went to the movies, but the movies are thriving, and it's about a fraction of 87 million people, is there alternative places to go? There's so much alternative entertainment. And almost every actor I've met in the theater and almost every writer I've met for the theater has moved into movies and television and other things. And
But people move back and forth.
Back and forth. And I don't think they are completely without interest in creating a certain amount of money to support themselves and send their kids to school. And yes, I joked about negotiating with agents, but when an actor sees that there's a big upside in a movie, he wants a big paycheck to do it. When an actor sees that he's on Broadway or off Broadway and it's very hard to get through it, and I talked about some of the costs, that actor is willing to work for the love of the theater. But it's not the love of the theater. It's the love of the process of creating art. And that takes money. And the thing that I'm nervous about is the nonprofits getting the funding so they can continue even at a smaller pace. I, for instance, wouldn't have, and this is so dangerous, so and nobody's going to agree with me, I would shut down PBS, for instance, because I don't think in our economic time we need PBS, because the PBS was created when there were 3 television networks and there were no other voices. Now there are hundreds of cable channels and Bravos and A&Es and news channels, and voices can be heard. What we don't have is enough money to fund things like orchestras and nonprofit theaters and so forth. So I would take that money and move it into a place where there isn't a commercial venue, where the government doesn't need to be involved. But my wife was on the board of KCET in California. They asked me to speak once. That's the only time I ever spoke there. She was practically thrown off the board because my speech was how they should shut down. So that was that went over very badly. Yeah. But I don't get why we're funding something where you can, all of that stuff can be funded in the private sector, whereas what you do cannot be.
Well, I just want to say that what I'm hoping I spoke to some students at Harvard, theater students, and they asked me what's one thing I wish I had studied. I wish I had gotten an MBA in business as well, because I don't think that we should necessarily accept the fact that we do the things that we do for love, in part because a lot of people who started out when I started out disappeared. Or, you know, sure. There's a wonderful choreographer I know with barely any teeth. And, you know, we end up needing health care and all these kinds of things. These are serious things. So I don't think that we should necessarily wear our poverty with a great, carry it with a banner. And I encourage younger artists to make new structures, new business models, and to find ways of collaborating so that they can, for example, share a lawyer. I mean, you talk about agents. What about lawyers? I finally got it, just don't call them.
Well, they have a real process which is bad. I hope they're not here.
I'm sure there are some
They
lawyers.
either take like 5 or 6% of your gross, the lawyer, I'm not talking about the agent, which in Hollywood can be substantial, or they charge by the hour, as you know, and it becomes difficult. But I guess we need them. I use them all the
If
time.
I could,
We need them because we need
As I'm
them.
going to be sued by the
But I do think
PBS.
that we need them. But we need them, but I do think that there's a way that artists are trained, which is a kind of a process of infantilization that is a weird relationship to authority. I mean, if any of you saw Fred Wilson's longer talk that he gave 2 days ago, I mean, I'm amazed the man is walking around alive. He is asking such intense questions, and he gets away with it because he seems so charming, right? So on the one hand, or Chuck talking to us about how charm has gotten, what charm has done for him, and so they're like bad boys, but they're disguised as good guys, they're enfants terribles, disguised. But so in this sort of way that we're trained to supposedly these lofty ideas about speaking truth to power and all of this stuff, as business people, we come out totally infantilized, depending on agents to tell us what to do, depending on lawyers, depending on all these people. And
By the way, there are a lot of executives that are just as infantile.
but isn't part of the infantilization of artists in the theater partly the result of using a business model for a way of life which was not meant to be a business for the people who were practicing it? I'll make this very quick. I have one aesthetic thing to say and one business thing to say. One of the things that interests me on the artistic side of theater, and one of the reasons I love being a playwright, is the scarcity of plays that have survived 2,500 years of the theater. There are patches of hundreds of years where there are no plays that we still do. We have 20 plays of the Greeks, and then we have a couple of Roman plays, maybe. No plays for several centuries, and then to the Elizabethans, and then to Restoration Theater, between Sheridan and Oscar Wilde, 100 years. No plays that survived. And I'm fascinated by the elusiveness of that thing that remains still doable in the plays that we still have. Put that to one side. Now, look at American theater up until, let's say, 1900. I would bet that if I asked everybody here to name an American play before 1900, Our American Cousin is probably the only play you'd know, because Lincoln was shot at it, and for no other reason, because there are no other plays that are surviving. So I'm interested in this question.
Do they really play Our American Cousin now?
They do it at Ford's Theater,
Okay.
sort of out of theme park reasons.
It's a very funny
But
play.
here's another interesting convergence for me in time, which has to do with what I just said. Up until, in Shakespeare's time, if you were a playwright, and for centuries after, you wrote a play and a producer said, I'll give you £5, or I'll give you $200, and he could make $200,000 by running it as much as he wanted, and you had no rights to it. In 1925, the Dramatists Guild was formed, and it was formed by the big playwrights on Broadway, George S. Kaufman, and everybody except George M. Cohan, refusing to let producers do their plays unless there was a contract that made them professional playwrights, that let them earn their own living. And so the Dramatists Guild was formed, and producers at that point had to playwrights became basically grown-ups at that point. They had been infantilized before that by producers because they were employees of producers, or they were basically bought off by producers. Now here's the convergence. Look at 1925. We can't name a play from before 1925. Look what started in 1925. You have, in this country alone, Eugene O'Neill, Clifford Odets, Maxwell Anderson, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller. You name it on up. Suddenly, that cannot be an accident that playwrights suddenly became independent agents. It's like they stopped being objects and became their own people. And that is what cannot go backwards. That is what the Dramatists Guild is now worried about. Playwrights cannot give away what we won in 1925, or we will be employees, and that can never happen.
You know, the real beginning of that, I mean, this is getting a little deep, started with Lincoln. And Lincoln, when he was a lawyer, and then when he became president, believed in patents and copyrights. And Lincoln believed and was the architect that things of the mind were of worth. And he wrote extensively that if you didn't allow people who made things of the mind to make a living, nobody could afford to make the living for which they loved. And in the argument that I had with Justice Breyer at lunch one day, because he was on the, thank God, on the minority, the Supreme Court, and with Professor Lezik at Harvard, is the extension of the copyright law, is the extension of the idea that things of the mind are of value. But I will say the following. Your anger, which is palatable, about infantilization, if that's the word, of playwrights, makes me think of the following. Every time we had a problem at Disney, we had 120,000 people, so we had everything. We had every disgusting thing you can imagine. Not as much as some other bigger institutions, but we had a lot. And every time it happened, we dealt with it, and then I would say to our people, you know what? If we didn't have those things, we'd have nothing to make movies about. We are living, we are the human beings of which we are making art. So the fact that a producer was trying to screw you, I'm sure you'll write a play about it. It'll probably be very good, maybe about the labor movement, and maybe it is part of life. And it is a business, and you have to recognize that it is run by people, not institutions. And if you want to look at the baseball union versus the owners, finally free agency came along, and all of a sudden baseball players who have a very unique ability to hit that ball where others can't, can make a lot of money. And this is the give and take of commerce, and you're part of it. So the best way to deal with it is to write about it.
But nobody wants producers to make money more than I do, because I'm as dependent on producers as the next playwright. It's how they make their money that is what I'm worried about right now, and how nonprofit theaters make their money.
See, we wouldn't sign that agreement at Disney. So I'm so absolutely on the other side of the fence from where you are. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't sign it for Beauty and the Beast and Lion King because our process is working together. Whereas the New York theater, the writer is king, and you can't touch anything without the writer. The movie process is you kind of work together. So we wanted to work together. Sometimes that is a good process, sometimes that's a stifling process, but it's a different process. When I went into, and Graham Gunn is here, and you made one very good point, by the way. I think they should teach charm.
They should.
In all these schools, because the people, and you'll see it at 5 o'clock if you go to Frank Gehry, the number one talent of architects is charm. Because it's hard to get something built. It's very hard. It's easy to, it's not easy, but the cheapest things are, the drawings. So you got to go into a bunch of bankers and things. You better be charming. So that's a very good piece of advice. I don't know what I was. I can't remember what my other point was. So
I had a couple.
I want to go back to audience. Okay. Just say this much about audience in the theater. Is when Raisin in the Sun was recently on Broadway with Sean Puffy Combs, and I wrote something in the Times about that play and its success, and another play, and I'm not going to mention the name of that other play. And I talked to the marketing directors of each one. The marketing director of the other play had a very traditional way to think about marketing in a play. I'd heard this before. But the guy who was marketing Raisin in the Sun on Broadway, number one, it had the luminariness you're talking about because Sean Combs was in the lead role. He was marketing it like a nightclub. They were handing out things. I'd never been in an audience like that in terms of youth and vitality and everything else. So I don't think it's so huge, this problem of audience. It's just that the people who develop them in theaters, they need different kinds of people doing it. I mean, you know all about audience, and you know all about marketing. We don't have in the theater, the kinds of budgets people have in the movie sport, but that's just a matter of having more creativity.
It's really expensive in New York I mean, it's like $100,000 a week just to keep the show up. It's, at least $75,000 a week of just little teeny marketing. All of this business about marketing on the internet for a show is very expensive to target it. So you're absolutely right. One other point, which I want to just add on to David's point. I don't think, at least in my experience, there is discrimination against women or anybody in the line of writing, of creating. And I think the definition of how few plays there have been since time immemorial is the reason for it. This is that, in my experience, if somebody can deliver us something good, we don't care from where it came. It is all about getting something great. And I have never seen on the talent side, I've seen it on the executive side, I've seen it on the union side, getting into the various different unions in the movie business. But if somebody walks in, man, woman, child, whatever it is, with a great piece of material, that person is honored. So the discrimination, whether it's age discrimination, sexual discrimination, is not at the stage. So I wonder whether the reason that woman's play has not made it to Broadway really is about the fact that she's a woman. I think it probably is.
No, I don't think that's what you're saying at all. I mean, I think it's two different things. What I say about the 70s is I was surprised, before the study was done, women playwrights got together in New York to say, our work's not being done. That was something that I heard a lot in 1976. I was surprised it was happening now. And I'm surprised it's happening now that this report came out by this young economist saying, hey, it's true, their work's not being produced. But I think when you're talking about not Lynn's play, it's more about, it wouldn't even, in this case, it may not matter if it was a man who wrote it. You're talking about that play, right?
That play is not a
and
Broadway.
It's a great play.
It is a fantastic play, but it is not necessarily a Broadway play. It doesn't have a star. They would have to put a star into it because stars drive Broadway plays now. That is just.
But I think that gets to the question of, is Broadway the only entity? I mean, look, Eve Ensler's play, The Vagina Monologues, is probably being played on almost every college campus right now. So to me, sometimes works of art are about the amount of influence that they have and where that influence is played out. It doesn't have to be Broadway.
And that's what I said at the beginning about how there is Broadway and there is that other theater which is sometimes done in double-digit budgets, and that theater is where there is this sort of traditional life of the theater. Broadway is about entertainment, and God bless it, and it has to make money to survive. Fine. If it doesn't survive, then it's not. It hasn't been run right to make money. But my interest in the theater, my passion in the theater, is about excellence. Wendell Berry once said, "The preserver of excellence is abundance." And so the abundance of that theater, of fringe theater, of young playwrights doing plays, is to me what's exciting. And it's great that Broadway's there, but that's not the only place. And if Broadway goes away, too bad. But there will be theater. Theater comes about in times of great change. Great eras of theater are times of great change. Elizabethan England, Restoration England, ancient Greece. America is the land of change. And
Civil rights movement and the anti-war movement led to the off-Broadway theater.
And exactly at the same time. And so as long as America changes, as long as we are a nation that continues to have that kind of ferment, including the kind of ferment that's on the stage right now, we will continue to produce theater. Theater stops happening when you reach a kind of bland status quo. That's why there was no memorable theater between Sheridan and Oscar Wilde. You entered the Victorian era, and it was an era of crushing sort of conformism. And so I have all the hopes in the world for American theater because of what I see both on Broadway and off Broadway.
Stopping on that note, let's open up for questions to the audience. And do we have someone handling the microphones? Okay. I guess the mics are back up there. Do we have any questions? Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Bobby Eisner, and I'm a Bezos scholar. I'm in a theater program in my community, at my community center, which is suffering financially. And even though my program is one of the biggest money makers for the community center, they're still pushing to decrease the budget for our program because the arts don't give anything tangible to the community. How do I answer executives on my community board that say that the arts don't give anything tangible to the community?
Change the board. I mean, that's. I mean, go out and vote for somebody else to go on the board because that's ridiculous. I mean, unfortunately, across schools all over America in the public system, the arts are being cut back, and and unfortunately, a lot has to be cut back, and it's an easy thing to cut back. It's not on the SAT exam, and it's a problem. And it's one of the problems that why the Aspen Institute included arts in its program, so it isn't the cutback.
Well, the tangibility is that elusive thing about art, and always has been, of course. If you're looking for something tangible in art, you're looking for the wrong thing in the first place. But let me go back to what I said about the history of theater. Who would remember who Queen Elizabeth was if Shakespeare didn't live in her reign and create and not be the greatest, literary genius of all time? We partly remember of ancient Greece, those plays and the philosophers. Name a single member of any board from Athens in 423 BC. And so the tangibility reaches across the centuries because theater is the spirit of the age embodied in ephemeral people. And so
Maxwell Anderson actually wrote a short story exactly to that point, called Whatever Hope We Have, which was, if you want to read anything that will inspire you to support the theater, it's that point exactly. And it's not only being in the theater, but it's being a witness to the theater, a supporter of the theater, and it's basically whatever hope you have for America, because he's writing about America, is at least keep the theater alive, because it is that which keeps the spirit of democracy alive. So your point is
and even on a less historical thing, just as a local civic art form in which members of the same community can watch one another act out dramas that affect their lives, it is extraordinary in terms of building some kind of community cohesion.
See a film called O.T., documentary film about a group of high school kids in South Central LA who put on Our Town. It's very, I think you'll be very, very inspired by that film, and that it may give you some answers.
I have one more thing to say, which is, and I've said this before, which is that if theater is democracy in action, as far as I'm concerned, if this country wanted to do the best possible thing from K through 12, which I've heard used so many times here, it would institute drama classes in every grade level, because nothing socializes children like being in a play. There is no better way to learn about your fellow human beings, about your specific human beings who you're working with, and learn how to work with people and think together. And so if that's not tangible, I don't know what is. But somehow we think B-52s are more important.
Next question.
Hello, I'm also a 2009 Bezo Scholar. My name is Simon Bomi. And as a young person, and we're beginning to see these remakes of Hairspray and Footloose, so we're on the topic of musicals. I'm involved in theater, but I'm beginning to see a lot of my friends, just going out to the movies to see Hairspray. But when it comes into our local auditorium, off Broadway, they skip that and they see the movie instead. Do you guys foresee the possibilities of making them into movies and them, my generation, skipping the theater altogether as a possible digression of the theater? I'd just like to hear what you guys think about that.
Well, I made the first one, not Hairspray, but the first Footloose. We did very well with it. I never heard anybody tell us we were stopping theater by doing it. I think that, honestly, if they weren't going to see a remake of Footloose, they'd be going to see Transformers. I don't think that specifically is keeping people out of your theater. I just think you have to rally people around to the excitement of being in a legitimate theater, seeing something happening before your eyes that's live, which no matter how good a movie is, you just don't get. So I don't think that's really...
In fact, it could even, in an odd way, help, because there could be people who would first become acquainted with it through a movie and then want to do it, then be in it.
Excellent. Thank you.
My name's Maria Alexandra Beach.
Can't hear you.
My name's Maria Alexandra Beach. I'm a theater master's scholar and a playwright and a case writer at YESA Business School. And as a case writer, we're actually studying the Broadway industry right now. Mr. Eisner, I'm going to practice my charm on you. Thank you for Disney theatricals, because you're bringing children to the theater. And that's one of the very big gifts of Disney theatricals on Broadway. First, I was thinking about Aristotle and about how, yes, a musical is exactly what Aristotle describes in the Poetics. And he also says that when it becomes spectacle, it fails. And I think that's what was addressed, that Mr. Eisner, you said earlier too. If a musical costs $20 million, which is one of the costs of musicals on Broadway, and a play costs $8 million to be produced on Broadway, then maybe Broadway isn't the home for many plays. And so that, for instance, if language is a barrier, tourists who don't speak English will go see Mamma Mia, and will go see some of the musicals, but they won't go see plays. And so I think that for many plays, off-Broadway and regional is a home for them. And one of my concerns is that off-Broadway is now becoming a business too. And the only way, I'm a writing member, I'm a member of the writers group at Primary Stages Theater, and we are the first theater in off-Broadway season to have an all-woman off-Broadway season this year. And some of our subscribers have said, I'm not going to sign up for this because I don't know these names. And so I think that the audience has to, we can't think of plays as business, which is what I think David has been saying, that we have to think of plays as art. And so one of the pollutions that I see is that when we start just seeing plays as commodities and as product, then we start to, then we do lose audience, and we do lose, it does become too much of a business. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Any comments?
I don't think it was a question.
No, it's more of a, any comments? No. Next question?
I'm sorry, I did want to ask you to comment on that if it's possible.
I think if
the
your
business
point,
of off-Broadway.
It sounds like your point is still a business point. Look, when I was 22, I put 3 people together to invest in John Guare's first play. I think we each put up $5,000. For about the next 10 years, we received a dividend of about $7 a year. And I kept sending it to my 2 partners who were running 2 other companies. And finally, one day they called up and said, "You have screwed up my entire tax return. I wrote this off 5 years ago. Stop sending me the $7. Even off-Broadway, somebody has to put up the money so you can have the show. And if it doesn't return the money, they won't invest in it next time. Now today, there is no problem getting money for Broadway. It is flowing like we've never seen before. Now, I think that is creating the same kind of problem that we had not long ago before the bust in the movie business. You know, Spider-Man is budgeted, I think, $42 million. It will have to be the biggest hit in the history of Broadway by far to break even. So whether it's off-Broadway, off-Broadway, or Broadway, you must put a financial box around it. You must be prudent. You must be financially savvy. You must have somebody involved with it that has the ability to say no on occasion. But I can't, I think you're dreaming if you think whether it's off-Broadway or off-Broadway, until you get to public theater, that somebody's just going to write that failure is acceptable financially, continually. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm Susan Stone, and full disclosure, I'm both a public television trustee and a lawyer, but I will forego serving you with a
Flying out in
complaint
10
right now. Here's my question. What do you think the effect on live theater is of the internet and the digital age that we're living in? On the one hand, do you think it's sapping audiences and distracting audiences because it's so much easier to just stay home and play on your keyboard?
Stay home. When I went to see The Wiz just now, the lady next to me was texting throughout.
Right. Or, on the other hand, do you think it's actually encouraging the next generation of a really engaged audience? Because when people try to blog themselves or engage themselves in the written word, they realize how hard it is to do it really well, and they have an increased appreciation for the true artists like we have here today. I would just be interested in your comments.
I think that one of the problems of our time is certainly the problem of attention, and all of the devices you're talking about have certainly divided our attention. We seem to be in the age of interruption, you know. And the theater, when I was 20 years old, I heard John Guare once say, the theater is the place where people go to be quiet together and listen. And if we can get people to turn off their BlackBerries and not text during shows or not take phone calls, we may hold that tide. Because that is the place where it is. I mean, it's not surprising that a lot of ex-Catholics like myself are in the theater. Because, you know, basically you go to this place where you gather with a lot of people, you're very quiet, and you watch people dressed very strangely do things that they don't normally do. And so I think getting people to pay attention is one of the great problems we're going to be facing. There's a new book about attention, in fact, that just came out. And so I do think that it is a hard thing. It is going to be hard, yes.
But I do think it will expand worldwide the number of people that understand and know about the theater, the availability of theater, buying tickets easily. There's a lot of things that the internet achieves. Again, I'm not in the group that thinks people have ADD, that America's ADD, because they said for a long time you'd only watch 90 seconds on the internet, then it turned into 5 minutes, and now that Hulu exists, television shows that are quality shows of some kind, people will sit and watch it for an hour quietly. A lot of it has to do with the quality of what is the content. And I'm surprised that woman did it, because that was supposed to be so good.
Well, how could you
Well,
be?
she was just
She
crazy.
Was. No, I
She
don't
had taken
know.
it and thrown
I
it
don't
down.
know.
Well, maybe she's somebody sick at home and she was checking.
I have no idea. But she was busy.
Give her the break.
Any more?
Me? No.
Okay.
I'm
Well,
fine.
thank you, Michael Eisner. Thank you, Anna Deavere Smith.
Thank you.
Thank you, David Ives. And thank you all for coming.